I started the Real Mental podcast because it bugs me when film and TV miss the mark about how mental health gets portrayed. Real Mental is a podcast where a film loving psychiatrist, that's me, talks to directors, writers, actors, and critics to help people figure out their life by getting to the truth about mental health in the movies. Welcome, Matteo Salvatore, to the Real Mental podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, it's really fun to talk with you. I have a lot of excitement to talk about this film, No Other Choice, because I think it's going to be a great discussion. So why don't you just tell the listeners a little bit about who you are, and then we can start talking about the film.
Right, my name is Matteo. I'm a critic here in Toronto. I spent a lot of time ravaging through the recent releases. That's where I kind of tend to put my specialties, everything that's coming out, and giving my sense on what's good to see in theaters and what's worth skipping. I was on the ground for all of TIFF, seeing 40 films, and this one was right smack in the middle, so I had to read a lot of reviews to fresh my mind of what was going on in the film, because I had a lot of thoughts going out of it, but it was a 5-film day when I saw it, so there's a lot going on.
Yeah, I have a little trick that I do, which has really worked for me, which is I have a little app that I write a script into. It's like my little 1-minute script. And I just put my salient thoughts, and that just keeps all my thoughts clear. So after I've seen 50 films, I can still keep track of everything. Because it's definitely, the brain gets a little mushy. For sure.
Yeah, I've been using cue cards during the screenings with a little notebook, but then I realized halfway through the festival that I can't read any of my notes because it's dark in theaters, and it's been a little bit of a learning curve because I've never done 40 films in 11 days or so, but
we have to learn the tricks for sure.
We do.
Well, what did you think of No Other Choice by Park Chan-wook? He's quite a well-known Korean director. What was your thought about this film?
You know, I loved it. I went into the film knowing about the background of what went into making the film, and his kind of personal history with being expelled from the WGA, and then making the film about being fired, which is the core plot of the film, and just the way that he's able to insert real life moments and put that across in a film. And you could watch this film on a surface level and not know any of that going in. And it works. It works on every level. And I think that he's just one of the masters. There's about many different times throughout the film where I'm just on a technical and formal level. The editing, there's stuff I've never seen before. Transitions, it's just completely blowing me away.
Yeah, I really liked it too because, well, let's talk about what happened in the film. First of all, why don't you give a little synopsis of the film?
Right, so the film is about a gentleman, Lee Byung-hun, I believe his name is, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he's from Squid Games. The film's about he was in a paper factory and had a very secure job, and suddenly he loses that job, and he's kind of coming to terms with how to find a new job, and the job market is really bad, similar to what we're going through in Toronto, where nobody could find a job. So he kind of takes extremes into his own hands, and he begins to take out his opponents and take out his competition in the job market, and it creates a really fun environment for this film to take place in.
Yeah, it's a very dark comedy, and
very much so.
I found it really interesting because, this is a man who worked for 25 years in a job and had every expectation that he would be rewarded for his hard work and loyalty. And then, interestingly, in the film, Americans bought the company and then fired a whole bunch of people, and they were doing like this HR session, and they had them do this kind of tapping on their head and say, no other choice, no other choice. And that theme of no other choice became Man-soo, that's the character, Man-soo's motto in terms of him identifying his competition and then killing them off one by one. And it was his justification, his rationalization for his behavior. Well, I have no other choice. They told me this at work. And the thing that was so fascinating is that the level of desperation that he encountered, when he was about to lose his childhood home, when his kids lost their beloved dogs, when, his wife had to go back to work and give up all her activities and was disappointed in him. All of these things created such a sense of desperation that he was driven to extremes. And I did a little mini review, and I thought it was chilling but chillingly plausible.
Yeah.
That when people become desperate, they can do crazy things.
Yeah, and I love how Park Chan-wook is able to take that idea of doing extreme things, and still you have this kind of empathy, and you kind of wonder how justified he is in certain actions for Man-soo's character, because He does go to extremes that is undoubtedly wrong, but you kind of have that sense of empathy towards the character because you kind of see everything that he's going through, and it's just the perfect dark comedy in my opinion. He does everything to the 10th.
Yeah, absolutely. But this is a very interesting story because, as you said, Park Chan-wook had something happen to him. Why don't you tell the listeners what happened? Because not everyone knows what happened to him.
Of course, and this is a fascinating backstory. So back in 2022, Don McKellar and Park Chan-wook went into production on the show The Sympathizer, and the production ran through 2022 all the way to 2024, and it notably had Robert Downey Jr. fresh off of a Oscar win and Oscar campaign for Oppenheimer, which was impossible to miss. And right smack in the middle of this production in 2023, it's kind of hard to forget the 148 days of the writers' strike. And I believe it was 117 days of the SAG-AFTRA strike. I could be wrong about those numbers, but those dates that went through May to September were grueling, and no writing was allowed to happen. The WGA strictly said that you're not allowed to perform any writing services, knowing that Don McKellar and Park Chan-wook both decided to do rewrites on The Sympathizer, and that's where it got tricky. The WGA found out about that, and it ultimately resulted in the expulsion of both writers from the Writers Guild, and that's where the birth of this story kind of starts, where Park Chan-wook's trying to figure out what it means to get fired from what he thought was a very secure job being in the WGA and having his massive filmography behind him.
So he made a kind of an allegory, and in the film, he's killing off people. What do you make of that?
You know, when I first came out of the theater, I was a little confused about what I thought about the film. Now, with a little bit of time detached, I was rewatching Parasite recently, and the way that film critiques the higher class feels like very small jabs. The way Park Chan-wook approaches it feels like a really strong Mike Tyson right hook right towards the writing guild or whoever he's pointing at, where the way he goes about saying certain things in this film are just so in your face and really going for it that you can't help but just love him for it. And it's honestly one of the most entertaining things to watch all year.
Give me an example of how you think he gave a right hook to the people who had made him upset. Like, give me an example of something in the film that you thought was like that.
Well, for one, you watch this character Mansu going through the entire film trying to get a job, trying to do everything right. And I think that goes for a lot of his career because Park Chan-wook has never been nominated for an Oscar, and that kind of feels like the end point for every big director trying to get to that Oscar point. So at the very end of the film, when he finally does everything right, he gets into the room at the end and he's doing the job interview and he's just blowing the thing. It feels like it's just a direct thing of saying that Oscars aren't the final destination, the art should be. And I think he's kind of looking at not just the Academy and other big prestigious bodies in Hollywood, but he's also looking at other directors and he's saying, you know what, you guys shouldn't be looking for their approval. You should be working and just letting your art speak for itself and not worrying about anything else.
All right. So it's a kind of meta film because there's the psychology of the character and there's also the psychology of the director that are in play. And as you say, we don't need to know about the psychology of the director when we're watching and enjoying the film. But if we do know what had happened, then we can also have like a little bit more fun just, seeing how perhaps the director has put this character Mansu as his proxy and made him, do all this crazy stuff as Park Chan-wook's way of kind of expressing some of his anger and disappointment. But he did break the rules after all. I mean, he did break the rules.
100%. There's a lot that happens that is just completely unjustifiable, but very entertaining to watch.
Right. So both characters, like Park Chan-wook broke the rules by writing, and Mansu broke the rules by killing all these people. So they're both sort of like, rule breakers. And he's kind of like trying to justify it. And I'm really saying, to myself, yeah, maybe, they both like weren't doing the best thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I was watching the film and at times I felt that Park Chan-wook was maybe thinking of himself a little too in the right. And I think it's important as an audience member and a critic and someone who people do listen to, I hope at least, that Park Chan-wook was in the wrong and he shouldn't have been doing the rewrites. And the only difference I could really find is Mansu, the character in the film, didn't really do anything wrong in his job before he got fired. And that kind of was the key difference to me. But obviously once Mansu loses his job, it's all off the table and it gets a little crazy.
Yeah, it gets quite crazy. It's funny because you said that we have empathy for this guy. And I find it so interesting how a director can make a character who is basically a serial killer and we're rooting for him. And even though
Exactly.
like one of the people he kills is really seems completely innocent, like maybe a couple of the others are like, okay, they sort of deserve it. But one of them for sure, is like totally innocent and he's just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the way the film is made is we are made to have no empathy for the victim and to root for the killer, which I find such an interesting thing to do as an artist, that you're twisting the audience's allegiance to the bad guy away from the victim. I think that's such an interesting thing to do as an artist, to make us root for the serial killer. And now, let's pause for a quick word about my other podcast. I'm Dr. Marcia Sirota. We all need to be inspired and uplifted these days. We need a good laugh and we need to be moved. In the Ruthless Compassion podcast, I speak with a wonderfully diverse group of people. They've overcome daunting obstacles and they're making unique, exciting contributions to our communities and to our world. The Ruthless Compassion podcast has created more than 175 episodes over the past several years. Why not have a listen to it today?
And one thing I love that Park Chan-wook does to evoke that feeling that you just mentioned was throughout the film, towards the middle part, I'd say about Act 2, you start to see the family of Man-soo losing their wealthy stuff, for lack of better words. And the daughter plays classical music. And one of my favorite things in the entire film is Man-soo and his wife having to look at the daughter and say, you're going to have to cancel your music lessons. And how the choir, because it's choir music, and how losing that is a sign of them going down instead of going up. And it reminded me of Parasite and the way that the film of Parasite uses stairs, where the poorest characters in the film are the lowest down on the stairs and the wealthy characters have the very tall houses and everything. And stuff like that keeps on making you want to root for this bad guy. And you see him right after he has to deliver that heartbreaking blow to the daughter to say, I can't pay for your lessons anymore. He goes off and does these awful things. And you're sort of rooting for the character because you want the family to win at the end of the day. Same thing with the dog situation where they have to sell the dogs and I won't spoil the end, but some great stuff happening.
There's a scene where the daughter is actually curled up inside the doghouse. And that's so heartwarming and touching and heartbreaking at the same time, because it shows you how much she loves her dogs, but also how much she misses her dogs. And the other thing we have to point out is that they named the kids, I can't remember the kids' names, but let's say Jane and Bobby, and then the dog is Jane 2 and Bobby 2. So the dogs are named like little Jane and little Bobby. So
they're part of the family.
Yeah, they're like the little mini-me's of the kids. And it's, they really were part of the family, like big time. And so these kids were devastated to lose their dogs. And that was like the biggest thing, I think, in the families, and how humiliated Man-soo was and how devastated he was to have to give away the dogs because, what kind of a father was he? And then what kind of a husband was he that his wife had to give up her activities and go back to work and wear bad clothing, and they sold their car and she was driving a crappy car. And like, he was humiliated. And I wonder, I'm not sure, but I wonder if Park Chan-wook was humiliated by what happened to him. And so he has this character being very humiliated, but the way Man-soo deals with his humiliation is by becoming a serial killer, as opposed to, fortunately, Park Chan-wook doing it through art, which is probably a better way to sublimate your rage.
Yeah, one point I had to that was Park Chan-wook, he's come from a Korean culture and he was raised in the middle class. I did some reading about him. And one thing that I find really interesting is in Korean culture, and it's actually said in the film, that losing your job is like losing your head. And after some research, I found out that this book was based off of a novel called The Axe. And the axe is what cuts off the head. And I feel like in sorts that Park Chan-wook did feel humiliated, and this was kind of a reaction to that, and this was his response to being expelled from the WGA. It was a very, very crazy situation to go through, but then again, we got a great piece of art through it, and we get to have great conversations about it.
Yeah, it's true. I think you're right. Like in certain cultures, like in North America, you lose your job and it's unfortunate and it's, it's problematic because you need an income, but you're not shamed the way you are. But yes, Man-soo, the character, after 25 years, suddenly losing his job, it's deeply humiliating, and doubly so because he also can't be a good husband and father anymore. And that is such a point of his pride and his identity. And then you can see how he kind of loses his mind. He goes off the deep end and becomes like this murderer, which is, he was never that kind of a person. He was a very passive, gentle guy, and he's quite bumbling. He's quite a bad killer, at least at the start. He kind of gets the hang of it later on, but the first few tries, he's not very good at it because it's not really who he is, but he's become so crazed by the situation. But, on the other hand, Park Chan-wook took a chance and he got caught. And I think sometimes that's even more humiliating because, like, I'm going to try to cheat. I'm going to try to break the rules. And if you get away with it, you feel so smart. But if you get caught, you feel so ashamed. You feel doubly ashamed because you were breaking the rules and you got caught, right? So I think he was probably also angry at himself. I don't know him. I don't know anything about him, but I'm just thinking as a human being, sometimes when we get caught, we feel bad. Like, I shouldn't have been so stupid. I shouldn't have gotten caught, or maybe I shouldn't have broken the rules, whatever, but we feel bad about ourselves, right? So he was probably angry at himself and probably angry at the Writers Guild of America. And so he had to vent his anger somehow. And like a good citizen, instead of turning to murder, he turned to art. And so we got this really fun movie about kind of a parallel figure who tried some different kind of techniques or tactics after losing his job.
Exactly. And the thing I went back to when thinking about that and having conversations about that was this sense of honesty. And when you cheat the system, you kind of lose that sense of honesty. And I come from an Italian culture, and that's very much the last thing you want to do is lose your honesty. So knowing that he's from the Korean culture, which is very hard on each other, and he must have been really looked down upon, which must have fueled a lot of flame to make this film as good as it was. And I'm really interested to see where he goes next after this, because this feels like a very personal film. And same with Decision to Leave. I'm really curious where he's going to go and if he's going to stick to TV. I haven't read much about what he's working on right now, but it's something I'm really looking into.
Yeah, because it sounds like he got it out of his system. But is he still out of the Writers Guild? He's not coming back? Is that a permanent expulsion?
Yeah, he will never be back in the WGA, and the same thing goes for Don McKellar, which is the Canadian legend. Sadly, he'll never be able to work within the WGA ever again.
Wow, that's a big, big, big penalty.
Yeah, and one thing I don't think a lot of people are talking about, along with the expulsion from the WGA, is the Oscar chances at this film are slim to none now. I wouldn't put it past the Oscars just to get it by, because the voting body is so big right now and so broad with different demographic of voters. But one thing that I don't think anybody's talking about is the WGA makes up a massive part of the writing votes. That's not going to probably happen for this film, sadly.
Yeah, so he definitely would not get nominated for any writing awards for the rest of his career, probably. Such a shame.
Yeah.
Such a shame. So he took a chance and he got quite a devastating consequence. So in a sense, his story, not necessarily the film story, but his story is really a cautionary tale about, as much as you want to do something, there are definite risks to breaking the rules, and maybe you want to think twice about it. The movie doesn't quite give you the same kind of message, which I think is very, very interesting. He doesn't have his character facing the kinds of consequences that he and his friend McKellar have to face. But in his life, for sure, like this is a very, very dire consequence, and very, very sad for, two very, very talented artists to be sort of in that position. But I guess, as you said, he's saying those awards don't matter. What matters is doing your art. So if he can live with that, if that's his rationalization, it's too bad. But if he truly believes that, then it's fine, because he can live with it.
And I can't help but thinking that he's going to end up fine. He'll land on his feet. This is his 12th feature film, and he has worldwide acclaim. So I think that we'll see a much more smaller scale work from him. This film itself is crazy to be made, and Neon is distributing it. And I'm just amazed to see how big of a promotion it's getting right now. It played at Venice, I believe, and TIFF. I'm not sure which other film festivals it played at, but it got really well reviewed. So it's going to be interesting to see where this film goes, how the box office works, and if he's able to leverage this into anything big going forward. Sadly for Don McKellar, it seems like his career has kind of taken a churn for the worse, where he hasn't had really anything coming out soon. And since the WGA strike, it's just been crickets from him.
Well, we'll have to see how it goes. But yeah, no other choice. I think it was the second runner-up for People's Choice International Film, something like that.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, so it did pretty well there. And yeah,
Yeah,
I think there's always an audience for a very dark, violent comedy. I think
yeah.
that's a good theme. And economic desperation, family, these are all very, very popular kinds of themes. So I think it'll probably do well.
One thing I'm very hopeful for in the future is for this release in December and ultimately in January when it goes worldwide. Is right now there seems to be a big need for revolutionary tales in the box office. People loved One Battle After Another, and Paul Thomas Anderson's getting worldwide praise for his revolutionary tale. And if no other choice is not Park Chan Wook revolting against the Hollywood system, I don't know what is. And I really hope people cling on to that, not even just on a Hollywood scale, but just on a personal level where you lose your job. And no one goes out and does what Mansu does in the real world, but people get angry when they lose their jobs. And it feels like a dark fantasy to go out and watch this movie. And I feel like it's going to connect to a lot of people, and a lot of adults are going to really like this film. I don't think it'll have the box office that One Battle After Another has, but I think it has the opportunity to have the cultural impact.
Well, there's something in psychology called the shadow. The shadow is the part of the psyche that is the dark part, like the part that we don't want to admit that we have, the inner serial killer. It's the really, really dark, icky, ugly, nasty bits of our psyche that we don't want to admit to even to ourselves. But we all have it. Like everyone has a shadow. Regular people tend not to act out their shadow. This film, no other choice, the guy is enacting his shadow. He's doing the things that, like you said, maybe some of us, when we're angry, fantasize about doing. I wish I could just kill the competition. I wish I could kill that person. That's our shadow, that murderous rage. So he, in the film, because it's art, he gets to act out that murderous rage. And I think you're right. I think this is a time where a lot of people are very frustrated, and we need to be able to access some of our anger and indignation about our situation. And obviously, the film is not encouraging people to, run around killing other people, but it's really saying, it's okay to be angry, and it's okay to acknowledge that you're angry. And, maybe there's other things you can do with your anger, like make art, right? Or, protest or whatever, but you don't have to do what Mansu did. But I think it's a great commentary about how we do have anger, we do have rage, and everyone has a shadow. And what's your choice? How are you going to deal with your rage? Are you going to kill people, or are you going to create art? And I think that's a really good question for us all, because the shadow is something we need to integrate because it's got power. And so if we own our anger, if we own the shadow, we have more power, we have more energy, but we don't want to be doing evil things in the world, clearly. So I think it's a really good film to get us thinking about the shadow and what we want to do with our own shadow and how we are going to deal with our own anger. Because a lot of times when we suppress the shadow because we don't want to think of ourselves as having that murderous rage, we implode, and then we make ourselves emotionally or physically unwell, or it leaks out in these like passive aggressive behaviors or sort of nastiness. So, denying our shadow doesn't help us. Leaking our shadow doesn't help us. Expressing our shadow fully doesn't help anyone around us. So how do we deal with our shadow? A really good way is to integrate it and find a way to transform it into something positive like art.
Right on. And one thing that I felt very similar to this film, where another filmmaker only 2 years ago had this same thing where, like you said, the shadow of this dark feeling. David Fincher made a film called Mank, and that film was his shot at getting an Oscar. All the stars were aligning. It was a film about Herman Mankiewicz, who made Citizen Kane, and the film completely bombed. Everybody just liked it heavily. His very next film is called The Killer, about an assassin who takes a shot and misses it. And I just can't help but think that Park Chan Wook is taking a book out of David Fincher's playbook that he went through only a few years ago. Of they're both very similar films in their own right, and it's just taking that pain and turning it into art, like you were saying. It's honestly inspiring to watch, and it's one of my favorite things to see on screen.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. To me, like I feel so lucky that I have a creative outlet in writing because it enables me to transform everything into art. And,
Yes.
I feel so fortunate to have that. And, I think we all need to have an outlet for our dark emotions, for our shadow. And for these people like Park Chan Wook who get to be creative in this really amazing way, it's such a gift, right? And so he really did transform this terrible situation and this terrible anger and pain and humiliation, perhaps, into a really great piece of art. And I think it's a great movie. It stands on its own without you even knowing anything about it. It's funny as all get out. It's dark as anything. And it's really like, it's fun. Like, it's a fun movie about a serial killer. Go figure. So yeah, I would highly recommend it to anyone. And I don't think it's in any way promoting the behavior. I think, when you're watching the film, it's very clear that what he's doing is wrong, but we can still get behind him, right? It's very interesting.
It's 100%, and it's honestly such a treat to be alive and living during the time where Park Chan-wook, Paul Thomas Anderson, and all these great filmmakers are making great pieces of art like this. 2025 feels like one of the greatest years in film in a very long time.
Yeah, definitely. And I was very happy to be at TIFF this year because I think the quality of the films was excellent and there was such a great variety. And yeah, I'm going to have more conversations with more people about the TIFF films this year. And I think we were very lucky to have participated in TIFF this year because it was a very stellar year, I think. There's a lot of art, and I think it's probably coming out of, the difficult times that we're living in, and people are really inspired to move all this emotion and create something beautiful out of the hardships. So at least that's the silver lining, right?
Yeah, and I think one thing that we saw a lot of at TIFF was, although this film was directly inspired by the negative effects of the strike, and there was a lot of negative effects of the strike, I think a lot of filmmakers got some time to stop and really think about what type of art they want to make going forward and what their art wants to say. And a lot of the stuff that we saw at TIFF comes from different demographics of artists, and all of them were saying some really amazing things. And I think for all the films this year, this is one of the most thematically rich films that we have a lot of different stuff happening.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, folks, go out and see No Other Choice when it comes out. And yeah, we're always interested here on the podcast to hear what you thought of the film and whether our feedback about it, our critique about it was, accurate in your mind, or was it off? Hopefully it was accurate. Well, thank you, Matteo Salvatore, for coming on the Real Mental podcast to talk about Park Chan-wook and his really interesting film, No Other Choice.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a blast.
This is Dr. Marcia Sirota. Thanks for listening to the Real Mental podcast. Please leave a review and your comments wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to sign up for my free newsletter at marciasirotamd.com. And while you're at it, why not check out my Ruthless Compassion podcast with over 180 episodes and counting. If you have any ideas for guests for either Real Mental or Ruthless Compassion podcasts, please email us at info@marciasirotamd.com. Happy listening!